Hello Internet, my name is Billy, and this is your guide to the Ventureverse, a YouTube series in which I look at each episode of the Venture Brothers and give a brief synopsis, point out interesting facts, talk about its place in the greater canon of the show, and finish it off with some personal opinions that I really hope to not debate in the comments. In today's episode, we will discuss the pilot episode of the Venture Brothers, The Terrible Secret of Turtle Bay. This episode first aired on February 15th, 2003. A full year and a half before the series' proper first episode would air, and it's a good thing because a ton of stuff in this episode is not canon. But before we get to that, here's what the episode is about. The Venture family heads to New York City for a science exhibition at the United Nations. As the boys get into hijinks around New York City, they are stalked by the Monarch. Meanwhile, we are led to believe that Otaku Senzuri is trying to steal Dr. Venture's latest invention. But in the end, it turns out he's a mostly harmless technology fetishist who just wanted to masturbate to it. The episode's title I had always assumed was just a few random words stuck together that sounded cool and pulpy, but I didn't realize that Turtle Bay is actually the neighborhood in which the UN is located. Otaku Senzuri was not the original antagonist for the episode, as Jackson explains on the commentary.
These two characters were not in the original script. The original script was written in like the year 2000, the first draft, which was pre 9/11, and this sort of mysterious villain was called Suspicious Arab.
Jackson's brother voiced a bunch of characters in this episode, but I really liked his portrayal of the mummy.
Oh, hey, wait a minute! There's no reason to go!
Blake and you'll miss it, Tycho DeBrahe walks by in this scene. Jackson explains who that is.
Oh, that was Tycho DeBrahe that passed by the camera. The weirdo scientist from like the 18th century who had a gold nose. Swear to God.
The hell?
I just stuck him in there. He's a maniac, and he respected dinner conversation so much, he revered it, that he refused to get up and go relieve himself in the middle of a dinner conversation, and his bladder burst and he died. That's how he died.
This scene with Otaku Senzuri trying to poison Dr. Venture is a reference to this scene from You Only Live Twice. And pre 9/11, this was supposed to be a model of New York City, and rather than melt, it was meant to explode. This episode features the first appearance of a whole bunch of characters who would go on to be regular parts of the show. Hank and Dean are pretty much the same. They begin the episode by looking for Scamp, who is often referenced but never seen alive in the present day again. There's even a reference about them not having a mom, which goes on to be a huge unanswered question throughout the rest of the series.
My venture didn't raise no fools.
We don't have a mom, Hank.
Brock is introduced next. He's mostly in character, except that he's a bit more rude and cold than he'll go on to be in the series. Also, chest hair. Dr. Venture is a bit more excited about science in the pilot than he typically is. He also seems to have a bit of a crush on Brock and desperately wants to impress him. The Monarch and the Henchmen have a complete design overhaul before the show goes to series. The old-style Henchman uniforms are maybe the only thing from the pilot that gets referenced later on in the series. Dr. Girlfriend is present, but looks real rough and only has one line.
Ready for lunch.
Pete and Billy are hanging out at the convention, which they definitely wouldn't even be invited to in season 1 of the show. Nor do they seem to know Dr. Venture at all. Professor Impossible's at the convention as well, but with a very different voice. But to be fair, he almost always has a different voice. Over the years, I've gotten a ton of people to watch The Venture Brothers, and I've almost always told people just to skip this episode because it's not really canon, and it has some pretty big shortcomings. First, there's this running gag about people feeling the Monarch's sting.
Monarchs don't sting.
That's funny on its own, but if you think too hard about it, it doesn't really make sense for a guy that's actually lived a full life as a butterfly-themed supervillain. All of the stuff with the prostitute just like does not work for me at all. I hate it. And Otaku Senzuri's voice is pretty uncool.
Oh, Mike Citroni was doing the most racist Japanese impression ever.
And throughout the episode, it gets even more.
It gets worse, yeah.
Gets
and
more
in the first
RL
scene, he's all
switchy.
deep and samurai sounding. He's like, oh, yeah. And by here, he's all trembly. Oh,
Yeah, just switching R's and L's. It's
messing
horrible.
up his R's and L's.
Regardless of all that, I actually think this episode is a better first episode than the actual first episode. And I'd have people watch it if it weren't for all the canon issues. The Flash animation is rough, but I actually think it has a ton of charm. I love this little tiny moment. I also think it's super rad that this episode gives the series kind of a cyclical structure, as this pilot takes place in New York City, and the show eventually relocates the entire cast to New York City full time. The best thing to illustrate my point about how much I like this pilot is to look at the very first joke of the show.
Wow, thanks. You totally got the kink out of it. And hey, I don't want to smoke anymore either.
That's it. And I actually think that's a perfect first joke for this series, because Venture Brothers is kind of all about characters living in a super serious, science fiction-y, Johnny Quest-y, comic booky world. But then, you know, something silly happens. That is this joke, and that is Venture Brothers in a nutshell.